Today we are going to explore a form of housing that has almost completely disappeared from the Swedish landscape, but which for centuries sheltered tens of thousands of people during Scandinavia's harshest winters. Before continuing with the video, remember to subscribe to the channel for more documentary narratives like this one. There is a forest in southern Sweden where the trees grow in silence over buried secrets. Among the pines and birches of Småland, a region known for its rocky soils and merciless winters, something awaits discovery by those who know where to look. Just a few meters away, most people would pass by without noticing. What appears to be a small elevation in the ground, covered in moss and wild grass, hides a wooden door weathered by time. A stone chimney barely protrudes above the ground. A small, almost imperceptible window allows a sliver of light to penetrate the interior darkness. This is a type of dwelling that history has almost forgotten. The inhabitants of this place did not leave behind grand monuments. They did not erect cathedrals or castles, but for approximately 300 years, tens of thousands of people like them found a way to survive Scandinavian winters, using little more than the earth beneath their feet, an ingenuity born of absolute necessity. This is the story of the Backstugor, the houses dug into the hills of Sweden, and of the people who built and inhabited them. To understand how these dwellings emerged, it is necessary to go back in time and observe the social structure that developed in Scandinavia over centuries. Medieval Sweden possessed distinct characteristics compared to the rest of Europe. Feudalism, which dominated much of the European continent, never fully established itself on Swedish lands. Serfdom, which chained millions of European peasants to the land of their lords, did not take root there. Swedish peasants maintained a degree of personal freedom and private property that was rare in other regions of medieval Europe. However, this relative freedom did not mean prosperity for all. Since medieval times, Swedish rural society was organized into clearly defined layers. At the top were the landowners, the farmers who owned enough fields to support their families and pay taxes to the king. Below them were the tenants, who worked others' lands in exchange for payment or services. And at the base of this social pyramid, often invisible in official records, lived those who owned absolutely nothing. They were the landless laborers, widows without families, the elderly without the strength to work, and orphans with no one to take them in. During the 17th century, parish records began to more frequently mention a term that was already circulating in rural communities, backstugusitare. The word carried a precise and for many stigmatizing meaning. They were the dwellers of the Backstugor, people who inhabited small cabins built on lands that did not belong to them, in locations considered useless for agriculture. Rocky slopes, edges of marshes, strips of forest too steep for the plow. These were the only places where they could erect their shelters. The Swedish government looked upon these people with suspicion. Since they were not registered owners, they did not pay taxes. Their dwellings, built on others' land, did not appear in property records. For the state, they represented an almost invisible population, difficult to control and impossible to tax. Laws attempted to restrict the practice, prohibiting parishes from offering housing to the indigent in Backstugor. But the legal alternative, a system called råttegång, was even more problematic. Under this system, the poor were forced to circulate from farm to farm, staying 1 or 2 days at each, following a fixed calendar. No one liked this solution. Neither the farmers who were forced to receive strangers, nor the poor who lived without a place to call home. Thus, the Backstugor multiplied silently across the Swedish rural landscape, becoming a practical solution to a problem that no law could resolve. Landowners tolerated these constructions on their unproductive land because they received occasional labor in return. The poor accepted any piece of hillside where they could dig their refuge. And the government, despite its official objections, turned a blind eye to a practice that relieved pressure on the parishes and avoided the costs of poorhouses. But how was it possible to survive in a house buried in the ground during winters where temperatures could drop to 15 degrees below zero? The answer lay in the earth itself. When a builder of a backstuga chose a site to erect their dwelling, they did not do so randomly. Orientation was crucial. The slope had to face south, the direction from which the maximum amount of sunlight came during the short winter days. In the northern lands of Sweden, where the winter sun remains low on the horizon for months, every ray of light that could penetrate through the door or the small front window meant additional heat inside. The first step of construction was to excavate the slope. With simple tools, the builder dug a space into the side of the hill, creating an opening approximately 20 square meters in size, about the size of a modern living room. The removed earth was not wasted. Part of it would be reused later on the roof. The exposed soil of the slope automatically became the back wall of the dwelling, and often portions of the side walls as well. In this way, the builder eliminated the need to erect 3 or even 2 entire walls with conventional building materials. In Småland and other regions of southern Sweden, wood was an expensive and scarce resource. Landowners controlled the forests, and cutting trees without permission was a crime. For this reason, many backstugor were built with fieldstones collected from the surrounding lands. Generations of farmers had removed these stones from their cultivable fields, piling them at the boundaries of their properties. For the builder of a backstuga, these piles of rejected stones became free building material. A typical cabin might have 3 walls of stacked stone and only 1 front wall made of wood, where the door and window were fitted. The roof was the most ingenious element of the entire construction. Over a structure of logs or rustic wooden planks, the builder spread layers of birch bark. Birch was abundant in Swedish forests, and its bark possessed naturally waterproof properties. Arranged in overlapping layers, it functioned like an organic shingle, directing rainwater to the sides and keeping the interior dry. Over the birch bark came 2 layers of turf, cut from nearby fields. The first layer was placed with the grass facing down against the bark. The second layer went with the grass facing up, allowing it to continue growing. In a single season, the roof became indistinguishable from the hill itself. The weight of the damp turf exerted constant pressure on the wooden walls below, compressing every joint and sealing crevices that would otherwise allow drafts to enter. It was a construction system that used gravity and moisture as allies rather than fighting them. The interior of a backstuga was Spartan by necessity. The floor consisted of packed earth, sometimes covered with flat stones to facilitate cleaning. Against one of the stone walls stood the fireplace, built of clay or stone, with its chimney passing through the turf roof. The fireplace was the heart of the dwelling, providing heat, light, and a place to prepare food. All domestic life was organized around it. Furniture was sparse and simple. A bed frame, usually pushed against a wall, a small table, a bench or stool, shelves fixed to the stone walls to store utensils and food. The ceiling was low, sometimes barely reaching 1 meter and 80 centimeters in height, forcing many adults to stoop upon entering. The doors were even lower, requiring visitors to bow deeply to pass through them. This feature was not accidental. A low door meant less area exposed to the outside cold and less heat lost each time someone entered or left. Windows were small and few, usually only 1 or 2 in the entire structure. Natural light was scarce. For much of the year, interior lighting came mainly from the fire in the hearth and tallow candles made from animal fat. But these seemingly austere conditions hid a thermal logic that modern engineers would come to study centuries later. The physics behind the backstuga was elegant in its simplicity. In southern Sweden, air temperature can vary by up to 45 degrees Celsius throughout the year, oscillating between summers of 30 degrees positive and winters of 15 degrees negative. But at a depth of approximately 2 meters, the soil maintains a relatively constant temperature throughout the year, generally between 5 and 10 degrees Celsius. A backstuga, built partially buried in a hillside, had its back and side walls in direct contact with this stable thermal mass. In winter, when the outside air froze, the soil remained significantly warmer. In summer, when the sun heated the landscape, the soil remained cool. The turf roof amplified this effect. About 15 centimeters of soil and living grass over the birch bark created a layer of insulation that worked in both directions. In winter, it slowed the loss of heat generated by the fireplace. In summer, it prevented the sun's heat from penetrating the interior. The grass roots kept the soil cohesive and prevented erosion, while the birch bark below directed any infiltrating water away from the wooden structure. The southern orientation of the entrance also followed a precise logic. In the northern hemisphere, the southern side of a hill receives the greatest amount of sunlight. During winter, when the sun remains low in the sky, its rays directly hit the front wall and windows, heating the interior during the shortest hours of light. During summer, when the sun rises higher, the very slope of the hill above the dwelling creates a natural shadow over the entrance, preventing overheating. Modern studies on semi-buried constructions indicate that this type of housing can reduce heating costs by up to 80% compared to conventional above-ground buildings. A house exposed to air at -7 degrees Celsius needs to be heated approximately 28 degrees to reach a comfortable temperature of 21 degrees. A house enveloped by soil at 13 degrees needs to be heated only 8 degrees. The Bakstugusitari did not know these numbers, but they knew something equally valuable. They knew that a single fire, carefully covered with ashes for the night, could keep the room above freezing until dawn. Who, after all, were the people who inhabited these dwellings dug into the earth? Historical records paint a portrait of extreme social vulnerability. They were widows whose husbands had died and who had no children to support them. They were the elderly who could no longer work in the fields and had no family to take them in. They were seasonal workers who found employment only during the harvest. They were artisans without a workshop, weavers, basket makers, carpenters who worked to order and lived in permanent uncertainty. They were orphaned children who grew up without inheritance or protection. Unlike the torpere, the tenants who had formal contracts with landowners and worked specific plots in exchange for payment or services, the Bakstugusitare had no recognized legal bond. They had no lease, no contract, and occupied no defined place in the formal agrarian structure. Their existence depended entirely on the tolerance of the owners of the land where they built their dwellings and the charity of the surrounding communities. Some managed to cultivate a small vegetable garden next to their cabins if the owner permitted. Potatoes became an essential food for these families after their introduction to Sweden in the 18th century. A small plot of land could produce enough potatoes to supplement a precarious diet. Some raised a few chickens or a goat, animals that required little space and could provide eggs, milk, and occasionally meat, but most depended on occasional labor and handicrafts. During harvest time, farmers needed extra hands, and the Bakstugusitare offered their labor for minimal payments or in exchange for food. Outside the agricultural season, they survived by making baskets, weaving, woodworking, or performing any service someone was willing to pay for. Some depended directly on parish charity, receiving aid that religious authorities distributed to the most needy. Swedish parish records, kept with remarkable detail since the 17th century, occasionally reveal individual stories that illuminate the hardness of these lives. In a forest in Småland at the beginning of the 19th century, a man known as Little John inhabited a backstuga that still exists today. Local records preserved a disturbing detail. Both John's mother and his brother drowned in the nearby lake, and the circumstances suggest the drownings were intentional. It was a silent testimony to the hopelessness that sometimes consumed those living on the edge of survival. In the early 19th century, the Swedish government began to systematically record the number of backstugor in the country. The property census of 1805 counted just over 28,000 of these dwellings scattered across Swedish territory. In the following decades, this number grew dramatically. By the middle of the century, there were approximately 45,000. In 1885, the number reached its historical peak. 50,000 backstugor dotted the slopes and forests of Sweden. These were extraordinary numbers. 50,000 small dwellings dug into the ground, each housing a family or individual on the margins of society. If we consider that each backstuga housed an average of 3 or 4 people, we are talking about 150 to 200,000 people living this way at the height of the phenomenon. It was a population equivalent to that of a large city of the time, dispersed invisibly throughout the rural landscape. But then, in a surprisingly short period, almost all of them disappeared. The decline of the backstugor was not caused by a single force, but by the convergence of 3 transformations that fundamentally altered Swedish society within the span of a few decades. The first was the land reform known as Lagerskift, passed in 1827. This law completely reorganized the Swedish agricultural landscape. The traditional village system, where farmers owned scattered strips of land spread across communal fields, was replaced by consolidated farms. Each owner had their lands gathered into contiguous plots, and many were forced to physically move from their ancestral villages to their new consolidated properties. Communal lands, where many backstugor had been built with the community's tacit consent, were absorbed into newly consolidated private farms. Some backstugusitare received permission to stay, many did not. Families who had occupied the same spot for generations suddenly found themselves without a place to live, evicted by new property arrangements that did not recognize their historical presence. The second force was industrialization. Starting in the 1860s and accelerating in the following decades, factories, sawmills, foundries, and railroads began to appear across Sweden. For the first time in history, landless workers could earn regular cash wages and rent proper housing in growing cities. The children and grandchildren of the backstugusitare abandoned the forested slopes of their ancestors and migrated to Gothenburg, Malmö, Stockholm, and to the new industrial towns growing around factories and mines. And there was a third option, even more radical. Between 1850 and 1910, more than 1 million Swedes emigrated, most of them to the United States. A significant proportion of these emigrants came exactly from the class of rural poor who had inhabited the backstugor. For people who owned literally nothing but their clothes and their manual skills, the promise of free land on the American plains was irresistible. The third force that sealed the fate of the backstugor was more subtle but equally powerful: shame. As Sweden modernized in the early 20th century, the backstugor became symbols of a poverty the nation wished to forget. No one wanted to preserve them. They were embarrassing reminders of a past that the new, prosperous, and industrial Sweden preferred to leave behind. In many villages, the backstugor were simply demolished when new houses were built. In others, they were abandoned and left to rot slowly in the forest. The turf roofs gave way under their own weight when there was no one left to maintain them. The stone walls crumbled and were swallowed by moss. The wooden structures rotted and disappeared. Within a few decades, landscapes that had been dotted with small dwellings became indistinguishable from the surrounding forest. The 1910 census recorded 22,658 backstugor still standing in Sweden. It was the last time the government counted these structures. After that, the category simply disappeared from official records as if it had never existed. But not all of them disappeared. In Oslo, a small locality on the outskirts of Falköping in western Sweden, something different happened. When the backstugor of the region began to be abandoned and demolished, a local historical association decided to intervene. Instead of tearing down the old cabins along the path known as Togaten, they decided to preserve them. Today, Oslo is the largest collection of backstugor preserved in their original locations in all of Sweden. 12 original cabins, built between the 18th and 19th centuries, line the old winding path. Visitors can enter these structures and experience directly what it meant to live in these spaces. The stone fireplaces remain in their places. The packed earth floors retain the marks of generations of footsteps. The low ceilings force modern visitors to bow their heads exactly as the original inhabitants did 2 centuries ago. The museum presents itself as a place that brings to life the heritage of an impoverished Sweden that has vanished. It is an accurate description. History is often told by the winners, the rich, the powerful. Oslo tells the story of those who had nothing and shows how they survived with ingenuity and determination. In Småland, the same region where most of the backstugor originally existed, other preservation efforts are underway. Mariana and Anders Agatorp live on a property called Stenhugen near Elmholt. On their land exists a backstuga that belonged to the same little Jon whose family members drowned in the nearby lake in the early 19th century. The couple spent years restoring the structure, rebuilding the stone walls, replacing the birch bark waterproofing, and renewing the turf roof. The restored backstuga now serves as a retreat for writers and as accommodation for visitors. People from all over the world come to spend the night in a dwelling that most modern Swedes never knew existed. It is an immersive experience in a way of life that disappeared more than a century ago. Another notable survivor is the Dalgångstuga, located near Konga, approximately 13 kilometers east of Tingsryd. This backstuga was built in 1859 by a worker who moved to the region with his wife and 3 children after finding employment in a nearby foundry. It is one of the best preserved examples of a backstuga built into a hillside. A local guide describes how the builder solved his housing problem with a handful of field stones, a few tree trunks, and a pair of strong arms. Half of the building material was saved because the excavated slope formed the back wall and parts of the side walls. These preserved structures are physical records of how the poorest people in one of the world's harshest climates managed to stay alive using nothing but the materials beneath their feet. The thermal logic behind them, the southern orientation, the earth-protected walls, the turf insulation, and the radiant heat from a single fireplace corresponds to the principles that modern architects of semi-buried houses use today. What disappeared was not the physics. What disappeared was the social class that needed these dwellings. When Sweden industrialized and the backstugusitare moved to the cities or emigrated to America, the backstugor lost their reason for existing, but some survived in Oslo, in the forests of Småland, and in a handful of other places throughout southern Sweden. In them it is still possible to step through a low door and enter a room that has not changed in 200 years. The walls are of stone and earth. The ceiling is close and cozy, and there is warmth. For approximately 300 years, tens of thousands of Sweden's poorest people solved the most basic problem of human existence, finding shelter from the cold by digging into the hillsides. They had no budget for wood, so they used the hill as a wall. They had no material for roofing, so they laid down birch bark and living turf. They had no insulation, so they let the earth maintain a constant temperature while the air above oscillated between freezing and scorching. 50,000 of these dwellings existed in Sweden at their peak. Almost all have disappeared. Those that remain are evidence that the simplest construction strategy, using the soil itself as shelter, kept people alive through centuries of Scandinavian winters using almost nothing. The story of the backstugor is not just about architecture or thermal engineering. It is about human resilience. It is about people who, faced with the apparent impossibility of surviving without resources, found a way to transform the earth itself into their refuge. It is about practical knowledge passed down from generation to generation, each builder learning from the previous one where to dig, how to orient the entrance, what kind of bark to use, and how much turf to pile up. This knowledge almost disappeared when the necessity that created it ceased to exist. But in the preserved backstugor that still dot the forests of Småland and the fields around Falköping, this knowledge remains inscribed in stone, earth, and wood. For those who know where to look and how to interpret it, these silent structures tell a story of survival that deserves to be remembered. If you found value in this journey through the forgotten hills of Sweden, consider leaving your recognition. Every view, every like, and every comment helps bring to light stories that the modern world has left behind. Not because the old methods were always better, but because some of them were remarkably effective, and we forgot to ask how they worked before they disappeared. If there are other forgotten dwellings, other lost construction techniques, or other ways of life that history has almost erased and that you would like to see investigated, leave your suggestion in the comments. Subscribe to the channel to follow future investigations. And the next time you walk through a forest or pass a moss-covered hill, look more closely. There might be a hidden door there, waiting to reveal its secrets to those who know how to look.